Can you hear me? So do I? Excellent. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Natalie. I'm a scientist. I'm the Arctic Program Director at Woodville Climate Research Center. And this next session is going to focus on wildfire and permafrost in northern regions. We had some sessions about wildfire yesterday, and what we want to highlight in this session is that the interaction between wildfire and permafrost thaw. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of the processes and what's happening now in the Arctic. The next speaker will be talking about projections of future change incorporating wildfire and permafrost thaw, and then we're going to have another panel. We had just an excellent panel. I hope you were all here for it. We have another panel that will feature Arctic residents to talk about the changes that they're seeing on the ground. Okay, so wildfire in the Arctic and boreal regions have been happening for a long time as part of the sort of natural ecosystem processes. This isn't a problem when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, or hasn't been, because regeneration is happening fast enough to sort of make up for the carbon that's lost during emission. But recently, the fire intensity and severity have been increasing across the Arctic, similar to other parts of the planet. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, one of the big reasons why wildfires are increasing in the Arctic is because the winters have been warmer, the growing seasons have been longer. 2020 was a record fire year in Siberia. 2021 broke that record. The winter before 2020 was quite warm. The growing season started earlier. It was quite dry. There were temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit above the Arctic Circle. The other thing that's happening in these northern regions is that lightning is increasing. And so, lightning was very infrequent, if occurring at all, in the tundra. And anecdotally, more and more you talk to Arctic residents and they talk about seeing lightning. I had never seen lightning in tundra until a couple years ago. And now lightning training is part of our field safety when we take scientists out to the tundra. And that was something that was never part of what we were thinking about. And then lightning strikes are also expected to continue to increase 2 to 3-fold. And the reason for that is because of climate changes in atmospheric conditions. I want to show this. This is a map of global fuel consumption. And I think, when we think of wildfire, at least in the US, we think a lot about what's happening in the Western United States. But if you look at this map, the orange and the red areas are areas of high fuel consumption. And you see these places in the northern latitudes are some of the highest fuel consumption in the world. And so as fires increase, carbon emissions are also increasing. And one of the big reasons why there's such high fuel consumption in the northern regions is because, as you've been hearing in these previous sessions, all of the carbon that's stored below ground. So when fires burn in the Arctic, they burn the vegetation like everywhere else, but it also burns below ground because there's massive stores of carbon. Whoops. Okay, so this is just some trends of carbon emissions from Canada and Alaska. We see have been increasing fires over the past several decades and projected to continue into the future. And then here's some fire emissions from Saca Republic. And this is where I want to point out, if you look in this last bar, this is 2021, and it's almost off the charts. If we think about what's been happening, that dashed line is the emissions from the fires in all of the Western United States. So this is really quite substantial in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of black carbon, in terms of smoke impacts, and all the other impacts that are happening on the ground, which you'll hear about in the panel at the end of the session. So this is another view. This is northeastern Russia, and fires. You can see the dark red areas are fires that are happening in the past 5 years. We see this increase in fires in the recent years, but also fires are moving north. So we're seeing more fires in tundra regions and areas where there are very deep peat deposits. But the other thing I want to point out here is that the blue shading here is all areas where there's permafrost, so perennially frozen ground, and we're starting to have fires increasing on areas where there's permafrost, and that's a problem because when the fire burns off the vegetation and it burns off the organic matter, that vegetation or the organic matter is really good insulation for permafrost. So when you remove that in the summertime, it's essentially like opening the top of a cooler. So all of a sudden now this permafrost is much more vulnerable than it was before the fire. So you get this carbon pulse with the fire, but now you're also making these systems vulnerable over very long time frames. So this is what it looks like when fire burns in a permafrost area. You can see this is an area with these areas that are light brown. That's kind of sphagnum moss patches, and the fires burned off all the vegetation and down into the soil. As I said, the impacts of fire can last for decades or more. Ground thaw increases anywhere between 15 and 35%, up to a decade or more following fire. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about, which has gotten quite a lot of headlines, is zombie fires. Zombie fires aren't something that's new, but they are happening more frequently, and they got a cool name, so now everybody's talking about them. But essentially, a zombie fire is just a fire that overwinters from one year to the next. And the reason this can happen is because the fires are burning below ground, because there's so much carbon. And so here's some satellite imagery. This is a fire from 2015. In Alaska, and you can see this is the outline of the burn scar from September. And then here we see that burn scar in April. Oops, sorry about that. And then this is a new fire that ignited in May. And people who live in Alaska know this is live in the Arctic, know this is a thing that's been happening. You can see where there's a fire the year before, and then you go in the spring and you start seeing the smoke again. The reason that these are increasing is they're related to climate, and they're particularly related to the previous year's climate. And so increased fires cause increased fires. So there's a positive feedback. When you have more fires, you have more of these zombie or overwintering fires. So you can see that in this figure here. So the orange line is the previous summer's temperature. The gray bar is the annual burned area. So this is from the previous year. And then the red bars are the number of fires that overwintered. So we see in years where there was a lot of fires the previous year, and also it was a very warm previous year, this then leads to increased overwintering fires. But the other thing that's important about these overwintering or zombie fires is that they also burn deeper. So we've had, and one of the things that's happening in the Arctic is soils that used to freeze through the winter are now staying thawed throughout the winter. This is the other reason why allowing these overwintering fires to increase. And so they're causing more fires and then also causing fires to burn at a deeper level of thaw. Okay, so just to keep in mind, the next speaker is going to be talking about the global implications, and then we're going to talk about the regional and local implications. But I just want to point out, globally, there's a lot of carbon that's stored below ground. The fires are burning off this carbon. 1.3 to 1.6 trillion tons of carbon stored in the northern permafrost region, twice as much as in the atmosphere and 3 times as much as in every tree and every forest on the planet. So this is a large pool of carbon that's becoming more vulnerable, and it's becoming more vulnerable both because of thaw and because of fire. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is, yes, this last IPCC report, so AR6, did incorporate in the carbon budgets permafrost feedback. It did not incorporate wildfire impacts on permafrost thaw. It did not incorporate burning below ground from wildfires. So there's carbon emissions from the Arctic that are happening that currently still are not incorporated when we're thinking about how much carbon will be released as a result of climate change in northern regions. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of how much carbon will be released? The estimates of carbon emissions there's still a lot of uncertainty, but I just want to point out, and partly because we're not accounting for fire, and our next speaker will talk about this some more, but by the end of the century, they may be on par with Russia, with India, or with the United States. So these are some of the largest global gas emitting countries, and not fully accounted for in an appropriate way. Okay, so permafrost and Arctic wildfire emissions that will use up a substantial proportion of our carbon budgets. We'll hear just how much in our upcoming talks. yet they're not fully accounted for, placing the global temperature targets at risk. There's no way we're going to make 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius for many reasons, but we're never going to make it if we don't do the accounting properly. And I just want to touch on some of the local impacts, and our speakers will be able to hit this much better than I am because I am not an Arctic resident. But we know there's concerns from wildfire because of black carbon deposition, which can land on ice and snow, leading to additional melt and regional feedbacks. Of course, impacts of smoke inhalation and human health. Aviation in northern regions, flying is how most places are accessed, and this is a big problem in terms of bringing in food and other resources. Tourism and recreation, natural resources, infrastructure, cultural resources, water quality, erosion, direct deaths, injuries, military installations. So there's a number of local and regional impacts that are really important economically, important culturally, and important for human lives and well-being. And with that, I'm going to 2 web pages if you want to find out more information. And I'm going to pass this off to the next speaker, which is Rachel Treharne, and she will be talking about sort of future impacts of wildfires and permafrost thaw and carbon emissions. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you so much, Sue, for that fantastic overview of fires and their role across the Arctic. And thanks all of you, of course, for being here. You've almost made it through the first week of COP, so that is fantastic. Thank you for joining us. And so, I broke it. So really, as Sue said, I'm a researcher at Woodwell Climate Research Centre. I'm interested in permafrost thaw and fire. And I'm going to pick up really quite directly from some of the points that Sue made about the impacts of fire in the Arctic. And you've heard about some of those local and regional impacts, which of course are really quite a broad range. So impacting everything really from food security to the impacts of smoke on human health. And we're going to delve into those and what it's like to really experience those, the panel discussion in a moment. And but we also know that on top of these really critically important local and regional impacts, what happens in the Arctic, and that includes the impact of fires that happen in the Arctic, really doesn't stay in the Arctic. This is something that also affects all of us around the world. And as Sue mentioned, this is really because the Arctic is an enormous carbon store. So this map here that you're looking at, this is just showing the extent of permafrost, so that frozen ground across the Arctic in blue there. And this region, the permafrost region, it really only covers something like 22%, so less than a quarter of the land surface. But in this comparatively quite small region, this stores almost twice as much carbon as there is in the entire atmosphere today. So that's more than twice as much carbon as there is in all of the trees on the face of the planet. And for a little bit of context, if we saw just 10% of this carbon that's stored in the Arctic permafrost being released into the atmosphere, then we're looking at an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations of something like 75 parts per million. So this is it's really a pretty significant change. And of course, one of the threats to the carbon that's stored in the permafrost in the Arctic is fire, as we've talked about. So again, as Sue mentioned a little bit, when the Arctic burns or northern ecosystems burn, a lot of the emissions that happen during the fire are actually coming from below the ground rather from the burning of the vegetation itself. So we have these really deep, rich, carbon-rich soils in the Arctic, and often those fires are smoldering away in the ground and releasing carbon that way. And on top of that, there is this very close relationship between fire and permafrost thaw. And I think you can really quite intuitively see one of the main reasons that this is the case from this photo. So when we have these fires happen, of course, you're losing the vegetation. And as well as that, you're really darkening the surface of the ground. So you've got this very dark, heat-absorbing surface. So really, this is raising the temperature of the ground. It means that these areas are absorbing more heat down towards the permafrost. And of course, this means that as the ground takes up that more heat, we're looking at either an initiation or an acceleration of both gradual permafrost thaw and these more abrupt permafrost thaw processes. So just for a little bit more clarity on that distinction, when we talk about gradual thaw, this is actually often what we're talking about when you hear scientists or others talking about permafrost thaw. We're actually talking about gradual permafrost thaw. So this is referring to this kind of process where we see a gradual warming from the top of the ground, basically grading down the surface of the permafrost. So it's this kind of centimeter by centimeter, year by year process. I mean, this is it's the dominant sort of source of permafrost thaw, but it is not the only one. So we also see what I'm calling here abrupt thaw. Abrupt thaw is actually kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different processes. If you were able to catch Jens's talk earlier about deep carbon in permafrost and some of the ways that is made vulnerable, these are the kind of processes we're talking about here. So slumps and kind of large-scale landscape changes that you often see in pictures like this one. And this is a process that it happens, perhaps affects a smaller area, but it can affect several meters of carbon really quite rapidly. So these are processes that can be taking place on the timescale of years or even days, as opposed to that kind of gradual, consistent, slower process of gradual thaw. So we've talked about these processes. We've talked about carbon release from fires and its effects on permafrost thaw. And then the question, quite clearly, for permafrost scientists and for fire scientists is how much carbon will be released from this store in the Arctic. And I'm going to do the classic sort of researcher move here of talking about why this question is so hard to answer rather than trying to directly go into the answer. And the first reason there is perhaps a little bit intuitive. So we know the Arctic, it's not just one place, it's a huge region. It's enormously variable, even over quite small spatial scales. And it's fairly sparsely populated. Parts of it are quite inaccessible. And the outcome of that is that we don't have the data that we ideally would like. And just to kind of highlight that, this is the map you've seen already showing permafrost extent. But on top of that, we've plotted the locations of monitoring sites that are recording carbon dioxide and methane fluxes throughout the year. And you can see there's huge expanses of the Arctic here that are really just have none of that monitoring happening. So we're really, in at least the respect of some large parts of the Arctic, we're really flying blind, trying to understand what is happening here. The second reason is that we're really actually only beginning to try and account for some of these processes in climate models and in the policy tools that are developed from climate models. And this is something that Sue touched on as well. And this is something that we're working on quite a lot at Woodwell at the moment. So at the moment, the situation is that a very small minority of climate models include anything to do with permafrost carbon at all. I think it's something like 4 models that are out there that attempt to look at permafrost carbon. And no climate models at all currently include these other processes. So none of those are including the release of carbon from below the ground as a result of fires across the Arctic. None of them are including those more abrupt permafrost thaw processes. And none of them are including the interaction between those two things, which, of course, we know is something really important and that will become more important as we see those fire regimes continue to intensify across the Arctic boreal zone. And so this is something, as I mentioned, that we're working on at the moment. And one of the ways that we're doing that is some work that I'm doing. And this is taking a kind of a reduced complexity Earth system model. So essentially a simplified climate model. And we're having a kind of first stab at putting some of those processes into this model, sort of in the face of those challenges related to data and things like that I've mentioned already. And so this is work in progress. This is not something that we've got to the stage of publication or peer review. But of course, I did want to try and give you a bit of flavor of what those outcomes might look like. And so what you're looking at here is one example of a sort of possible future of emissions from gradual permafrost thaw. And this is under a pretty moderate warming scenario. We're looking at RCP 4.5. And this is emissions from about the present day out to the end of this century. And in contrast, if we kind of use this updated climate model we have to rerun this scenario, and look at the emissions that we expect to see from those other processes we talked about, so from fire-mediated thaw and abrupt thaw, this is what that looks like. So you can see that this is really something that is on the same scale by itself as gradual thaw, which is the process that we tend to focus on. And even when we look at a much more extreme warming scenario, so RTP 8.5, when we know we expect to see much more widespread gradual thaw, even then we see that these underrepresented processes, which again are not included in any climate models, are really of a similar scale. And for a little bit more context here, this is the emissions from the EU in 2017. And these are the emissions from the US in 2017. So really what this is kind of suggesting is that if we continue to leave these processes out of climate models, we continue to leave them out of our carbon budgets and therefore out of these policy debates, what we're essentially doing is ignoring the contribution of something equivalent to a major economy by the end of this century. So what do we do with this information? Of course, we're all here at COP. And the obvious message really is just to kind of increase that urgency of mitigation. We all know that the window of opportunity to reach the Paris Agreement goals, to reach those goals of 1.5 and 2 degrees is closing. And really what this suggests is that that window is potentially closing even faster than we think. And I think what we all need to keep in mind is that these numbers that we talk about are carbon budgets, the future warming we expect in response to different scenarios. These things are not safety nets. We know that there are processes out there that are not included in those things. And we know, and we've seen here, that at least some of those are substantial sources of emissions. And so with that, I think we will be moving on to our panel. And I'd like to, as we sort of prepare that, give a quick plug if you're interested in these issues. Of course, ask questions and stick around and talk to us. And also on the front desk, we've got a lot more information and some briefings and also some little QR codes, which will take you to a platform where you can look at some of this data and play around with it and find out a lot more background about these issues. Thank you. And I think we'll move on to our panel. They will introduce themselves in a moment, but we are really lucky to be joined by Darcy Peter, my colleague from Woodwell, and by Dilma Clark from Vivo Barefoot, and also by Sam, who's also going to be telling us about some of the impacts that we're seeing from these processes on the ground. And this panel is going to be moderated by Natalie. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Drink Wednesday, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Darcy Peter, and I'll be moderating right now. And I just want to open the floor to Doma, Sam, and Sue already introduced herself. So if you two want to introduce yourself, that'd be awesome.
My name is Sam Chimel. I'm Kanaitsi Indian and Siberian Yupik from Gamble, Alaska. My community is one that sits at the in the middle of the Bering Sea in its northern region, and I come from a subsistence community where all of our food comes from our ocean. It comes from our land, and it comes from the resources that are around us. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today, and excited to see what comes out of this panel.
Um, Hi, I'm also can do the greetings in my indigenous language, Sembana. I'm coming from Siberia, from Lake Baikal. It's not that north or not part of the Arctic region, but my community is already suffering from what you've seen so far, and I'm here to share the story. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Darcy Peter. For those of you who weren't here at the last panel, I am Koyukon and Gwich'in Athabaskan from the remote village of Beaver, Alaska in the U.S. It's located about 4 miles below the Arctic Circle. There are 30 people who reside there year-round, and we also practice a subsistent way of life, hunting, fishing, and trapping, and everything that we collect is used and put into our freezers. Yeah, so thank you all for being here, and thank you, Sue, for your talk. It was awesome. I think I want to kind of shift gears here and ask Sam and Dolma what some of the climate changes you've seen in your communities and how that impacts your cultural way of life. And since I come from a community also, I'll answer after you guys do.
Well, thank you, Darcy. I don't know where all of you here come from, but I would venture that each of you lives in a place where there's a grocery store, that whatever's on your table at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day is something that you purchased, that you bought. It's not something that was caught or that you had to go catch or somebody that you know had to go catch. For our subsistence communities in Alaska and around the world, it's a very different reality. Our food that we eat on a daily basis is not something that we buy from a store. It's something that we go out and we harvest and we catch. This means that our diet of marine mammals, things like whales, seal, walrus, is critical for our communities. In our communities, we don't have grocery stores. We have incredibly high rates of unemployment, and things that you can buy from our village stores, which are very understocked, are incredibly expensive. Things like a gallon of milk might cost you $12 there, where it may only cost $1 or $2 here. And so we rely very heavily on our subsistence animals and subsistence foods to survive. Now, with climate change, we're watching those subsistence stocks change. We're seeing our animals come later in the year and leave earlier. We're seeing the reality that where I'm from in the Bering Straits, we're no longer having sea ice in the wintertime. Sea ice is one of the critical things for walrus to be able to calve. When walrus give birth, they can't do it in the water. They have to do it on ice. They don't like going on the land either. They have to do it on the ice. And what's happening is as that ice is moving further and further north, those walrus aren't able to stay in those places because the water is too deep for them to dive down and catch their own food. And so when it comes to climate-related impacts to subsistence, we're watching as our subsistence resources that we've relied on since time immemorial are being diminished, and they're slowly, and in some cases very quickly, moving out of our reach. And so this means that there is immediate food security needs that are being laid to bear by climate change. It means that there's immediate nutritional needs as a result of these animals being malnourished that are present. It means that there is a plethora of issues that are coming about as a result of climate change. So that's one of the main impacts that we're seeing from my community.
Thank you. I come from a really small community from Lake Baikal. We've been first indigenous people that basically settled there. Originally, we came from Mongolian side of the border, and 800 years ago we got settled. And my family, I was born and raised in a tiny community of like 200 people doing subsistence farming all day long, and herding the animals, and basically watering the plants all entire my childhood. And I haven't been since I moved to Britain as a human rights lawyer and social business sort of entrepreneur, I suppose. I haven't been home for a while. So I took my kids for the first time in 5 years this summer. We arrived in August, and we end up in basically almost like in a quarantine. When we arrived and we landed, I saw what looked like a fog, and was so dense, and I couldn't work out. Like, and normally we don't get this kind of fogs like that. I'm thinking, wow, like what the what's going on? And then they opened the door. It's actually smoke that came from the north. Even if the epicenter of the fire was like probably 2,000 kilometers away. Imagine how shocking it is when you land, you get that. I was reading about it on the news, etc., but I kind of never really thought it's gonna, like, you're gonna land in the middle of an environmental emergency. So then for 10 days we stayed at home, couldn't get anywhere, and it's quite, obviously it's devastating since my family lives there, and then for many generations everything was super predictive. Like, everything is super seasonal. Everybody knows when do we need to plant the plants, and when do we need to harvest, etc. Like, all this knowledge has been passed on through many generations. It was like so organic. And now we get the lightning, which we never really had before. Like, in it's very dangerous. Like, nobody actually trained, nobody knows how, like, when you're gonna be hit or whatever. So I think there's a whole like awareness that needs to happen. The second thing is around flash flooding. We also never had that, like, at this scale. And then obviously temperatures are changing. It's extremely scary and worrying that our brothers and sisters and tribes living more towards the north, they obviously, we never had like plus 38 degrees ever before. And yeah, it's quite scary what's happening, and it's all touching us on daily basis today. So yeah, and then I was privileged to work with indigenous communities in different parts of the world, but the most relevant one for today is the Sami community, and then I can share that project maybe a bit later. Yeah. So I'm here with our family company called Vivo Barefoot. We actually have a stand at the UNFCCC Pavilion, and we're launching this vision of regenerative footwear. So we've been working on this project for the past 10 years with scientists, anthropologists, with biomechanics scientists. And the theory is that currently the way how we produce and consume is obviously so disconnected from how we used to do everything food by food, from localized materials like thousands of years ago, when everything was extremely regenerative, localized, and sustainable. So we went back to the Sami community, to the San Johansi San community in the Kalahari Desert, to learn how we can recreate this logic and the way to manufacture and the way to produce things, but also make it regenerative. So with the Sami community, they uh, make this probably the only actually like trademarked shoe footwear that's made out of reindeer, and it's the lightest winter boot on the planet. But then now the community is getting affected on obviously the movement of the reindeer, and we're basically seeing it now firsthand, and we're trying to basically collaborate not just with the Sami community but the indigenous community around the world, like the Navajo, the community in India, in Mongolia, in Kalahari Desert, basically to preserve the cultural cobbling techniques, but making sure it's done in a way that it's net positive for the localized environment, if that makes sense. So the idea is that to launch a regeneration fund. So you all know about like carbon offsetting, but with these community programs, we can create fund for regeneration, where it's no longer about like offsetting or being like net neutral or net zero. Whatever we need, it's like we're way past beyond that. So yeah, so that's I hope I didn't wobble too much, but that's basically the idea. And come and visit us, and we can tell more. That's at the UNFCCC Pavilion stand called Vivo Barefoot. So yeah, that's where we're at now.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's super important work. And yeah, thanks for being here and for sharing your experience and your work. It's really meaningful. Yeah, so me, I come from an interior Alaska perspective, so non-coastal, and the changes that we're seeing in terms of climate change are directly tied to our culture, and you can't really have that conversation without talking about policy either in the U.S. So permafrost is thawing, obviously, in Alaska, and that's causing our riverbanks to erode. The Yukon River is a lifeline for many indigenous communities, if not all, along the Yukon River, and it provides food, water, shelter, everything that our people completely rely on as a means of subsistence, so survival. And if the permafrost is thawing, that's changing the chemistry of the water. It's changing the spawning grounds for salmon. For me, much like Sam here, it's climate change is creating incredible food insecurity in terms of what we're able to harvest and hunt and collect and put into our freezers and live off of. There's no grocery store in Beaver. The nearest one is 110 miles away. Freight is very expensive, so we rely completely on the environment for survival. And with the thawing permafrost and the eroding Yukon River, it's changing the salmon spawning grounds, like I said, and that is one of the many contributing factors to the mass decline in king salmon in Alaska. This past year was the first year since, I believe, ever, that my community wasn't able to fish. We were completely shut down by the Alaska Board of Fish. Because there aren't enough salmon for us to fish. Meanwhile, commercial fishermen in the ocean are bycatching hundreds of thousands of king salmon. So in terms of policy, it's very unjust. It's not fair at all. Indigenous people are contributing the least amount to climate change, and we're feeling the impacts and the regulations the most. It's a huge conversation, and since we aren't able to fish, a lot of the pressure for food shifts to then moose. And to harvest moose, I mean, there are regulations in interior Alaska that also are unjust. Out of the 1 month that we're allotted to hunt and harvest a moose, maybe 2 weeks of those are the moose actually viable, and is it easy to hunt and harvest a moose? So that's 2 weeks out of an entire year to get one moose. Each person's allowed one bull moose. I was fortunate to get a 2-year-old this year, but I was with a different family of 6 people. There are 8 people in my family, so that's a lot of people for a 2-year-old moose. It's very small. Meat's going to be pretty scarce this winter, but we have meat, and that's that goes straight into our freezer. None of it's for sport, so that's in my perspective, a lot of it is food insecurity and clean drinking water problems that are the impacts that I'm seeing in Beaver, Alaska, where I'm from. So we're obviously really tied and work really closely with cultures that rely on the environment. And this is a pretty science-heavy pavilion. And I think that I want to ask each of you, all of us, how do you think scientists and policymakers can better engage with, interact with, and learn from Arctic Indigenous residents? And how would that benefit to the value of the research and or policy?
I think this is coming to me. So I'm a scientist. I'm Sue Natalie, and I work with Darcy at the Woodville Climate Research Center. And I'm not from the Arctic. I live in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, the land of the Wampanoag people, and I shop at a supermarket. So there's a lot that I do not know. And as a Western scientist, the way that we get trained is to be very, very focused and to be an expert in a certain area. But we know, and then we try to do interdisciplinary work and sort of connect with other scientists who are really, really focused. But if you've listened to this panel and the previous panel, people who are relying on the environment and living in the environment, they don't need to sort of take the world apart and put it back together, because the world's together, right? I mean, you're talking about food security, you're talking about health, you're talking about, how you move around the landscape, what the habitats are for animals. And so I guess the best way, I think the question was how the best way to learn. I think the best way to learn is to listen. And yeah, like I have to tell that message to myself a lot, like just shut up and listen, because I learn a lot when I shut up and listen. And and also making the time to do that. I think that we often have this urgency of having to get things done and having to get things published. And so building in that time, if that's important, which it is important, because honestly, in the long run, we will get much farther, much more efficiently if we take the time to sit and listen from these experts in the way that we do the science. And I have to say the same thing goes for policymakers. I mean, I think, again, it should be a conversation and not just me doing my science and putting it out there and saying, here it is on a platter, and it's not really useful for anyone. So I think the same thing goes for policymakers, sitting and having the conversation and spending that time and having the conversation and thinking about and listening and asking, what is the science and how is it that you want it to be done? Like, what is useful? If that's a priority. If it's not a, yeah. So I'll stop there. Pass it on.
So I've done quite a lot of activism when I was growing up. Where at the age of 16, with a crew of my university classmates, we started an NGO to clean up the shores of Lake Baikal from rubbish, because there is no like social infrastructure. Like, government didn't put basically enough bins, and there is no like system behind to keep the territory clean. However, Lake Baikal is the deepest lake in the world, contains 20+% of the fresh world water, is UNESCO heritage site, and then this is how it's treated. It's like, everybody knows that Russian government is all over the place, and it was like, a bit helpless. So with the students, we did that, and then when I moved to Europe, I started raising funds and sending to Russia to support the program, because it's still going on. And then they did this law about international agents. If you receive funding from overseas or like outside of Russia, they basically our accounts got blocked, and we didn't have access to any of the finances that were raised here for like 2 years. So we had to do like tons of paperwork. So there's kind of like practical examples how terrible the system is in the first place. The second thing is like, how do you amplify the voices through whatever work you do? Like, we're an example of baseline sort of footwear business, but you can still utilize your product as a medium for storytelling. So as an example, this spring, we collaborated with a US-based NGO called Oxygen. It's like almost like an advocacy media NGO, and we did an open letter to UNESCO on stopping harmful algae blooms, and there was also related back to Lake Baikal, because it's all getting algae blooms, and they can be also toxic depending like what caused the blooms, because like the industrial agriculture, the water runoffs, and then it basically disbalances the system, and then the water that was pristinely clean, even like 6-7 years ago, now you get like all this green, I don't even know how to describe it, sorry, English is not my first language, but we used to just drink the water from the lake, basically, let's put it that way, and now we don't do it because it's like we never know what's inside now. So yeah, so I guess there's two things: co-create, and then somehow make sure the government listens. But it's tough, especially in my home country.
I guess my thoughts on this are rooted in one of the formative experiences that I've had. At the age of 16, I had the honor of sitting on our governor's climate action leadership team, which was led by the first Alaska Native lieutenant governor of our state. And in those meetings, it was a team that was 26 people, one of which was a Native youth, and the rest were scientists, industry leaders, oil and gas executives, forestry people, fisheries people, Native communities, that were all coming together to try and formulate a comprehensive plan with regards to climate change for Alaska. And I remember very specifically a meeting between myself, our lieutenant governor, and the chairman of research for the University of Alaska. And in that meeting, the chair of research for the university was saying that we need to study the things that our Native partners in this room are saying, because we can't prove them right now. There isn't scientific proof of what our communities are seeing, what they're saying. And so what our lieutenant governor said is, our communities have been living in these places for thousands and thousands of years. Their observations in a single day measure far past what Western science can see in an entire year, because it's built on our traditions, it's built on our historic knowledge, and it's built on the stories that we pass from generation to generation. Long before we were seeing currents changing, or Western science was seeing currents changing in the Bering Straits, my uncles were talking about how it was different. Our tides were changing, the ways that our water came in, the nutrients that was coming up, and the way that our whales were feeding. We were seeing those change in the 1990s. You didn't hear Western science start talking about this until the mid-2000s. Our communities are in a sense, from an observation standpoint, a canary in a coal mine. We're the first ones to see it because we're the ones that feel it. And so while we can embark on large research projects that take 10, 15 years to come up with conclusive results, our indigenous communities living in these places see these changes day to day. And so I think good policy and good research are done in such a way where there's collaboration and not consultation. I think a lot of times you hear consultation. And at the end of the day, what consultation means is that, well, actually, how many of you guys are researchers here? That would actually probably be more. One, two. Oh, actually, a lot of you. And are the others affiliated with NGOs or stuff like that? Yes. So in consultation, I think what happens, or what it really means, is that you can sit down with the indigenous community. We talk about what we want to talk about. You tell us what you want to tell us, and then you don't have to, you're not obligated to include anything that you've heard. You just have to listen to us say it. And this is our relationship with the federal government in the United States. We say things, they disregard it, they do what they want. Whereas collaboration means that you're working together with a community. It means that you're going to a community and saying, all right, what do we want to study? Because we have people come to our island oftentimes, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on studies that have very little applicability to the actual needs of a community. And so the scientists are alienated, the researchers are alienated from being able to gather any information from our people because we don't see its relevancy. And so in research, there needs to be clear and understandable communication about what is actually being researched, how that relates to a community. And I know that you have to submit abstracts to get funding and submit things like this, but trying to co-develop research goals is really critical. I remember at our island, there was a group that was trying to study sea ice. And they spent 2 years observing our ocean ice, and they came to our school to present their findings. And we had our Yupik language teacher, one of our elders in the school, and he saw their title slide, and he saw the first 2 slides, and he stood up and he told them their conclusion before they even got through all of their research. Not because he'd been paying attention to their research, but because he knew our ice. And so sometimes there's simple answers to the complex questions that are being asked. And really, a lot of time can be saved and a lot of direction can be saved just by asking the indigenous community, what are key things that we could look at? What are key things that you're observing? And how can we help to prove the things that you're seeing? Because when Western science and indigenous knowledge come together, you actually see good policy coming out of that. So those are just my thoughts, though.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much more I can say than that. Yeah, I think as a scientist and as an indigenous person, I have a really unique perspective just because I have 1 foot kind of on each side, maybe like 1.5 feet on the indigenous side and half a foot on the science side. Yeah, I think one thing that researchers and policymakers can do better echoes a lot of what Sam's already said, that you can spend time with the community. You can co-develop a project with an indigenous community that's going to be beneficial for both indigenous people and researchers. I don't see the value in research for the sake of research when it comes to climate change, because what good is research if it only benefits other researchers and it never works its way down to indigenous people who are living on the land and who are seeing these changes. It's really hard to be based in Texas researching Alaska when you're based in Texas. You're really disconnected from policy. You're really disconnected from the people. You're disconnected from the land. You spend maybe 2 weeks out of the year there versus working with people who've lived there since time immemorial and have a plethora of knowledge to offer if you so choose. And if that's a priority of yours, which it should be, because it can only benefit and add to the quality of the research itself. I don't think anybody would be opposed to having like thousands of years of research added. It can only add so much value to it, and that's something I think is really important. I think another thing researchers can do a lot better, besides co-producing projects, is they can communicate their science better. It's so easy, and there are requirements I know that people have to fill. They have to publish or perish, and then they consult an Indigenous community. They don't, work with one. They consult with one. They slap the tribe's name on the paper at the end, and they send it off to the tribe in a language that's completely foreign to them. There's graphs, there's tables that they don't understand. No one's communicated with them what this means for them on the ground, and they've just exhausted a bunch of resources Indigenous people have by sharing this very sacred knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation to get a paper that's maybe 20 pages long and that they don't understand. That where they saw so much hope in, like, oh my gosh, like, I'm going to go into policy and I'm going to induce change, like for food insecurity or for clean drinking water or for, jobs, anything that the Indigenous community might need. And they saw this outlet to maybe get something done is now just a paper that they don't understand. So I think something researchers and policymakers can do better is just to communicate with Indigenous communities, to have a newsletter that's full of pictures that exemplifies what your research means in a way that people are going to understand. It's spending extra days in the community during the field research season there to have a community meeting, get locals in the room and listen instead of just talk and project your own project out onto people. It's just listening, like Sue said. It's sharing your research in a way that people are going to understand. You can go on local radio stations and be like, hey, this is who I am. This is how long I'm going to be here. We have a community meeting. Please, I have no agenda here. I'm just here to listen to you guys and give you some food and snacks. It seems so simple, but it's so uncomfortable for so many researchers to actually follow through because it's so different than what they're taught in academia. That's my experience in the US, and I'm not sure if anybody else has anything more to add to that. So we still have quite a bit of time, but I think we might take some questions from the audience if anybody has any. But before I do, I kind of just want to ask anybody about their last remarks and what the key message is that you would like to give to international policymakers and people in positions of power who can implement change in Arctic Indigenous ways of life.
I can just do a quick remark. One thing that wasn't mentioned is about also empowering the community scientists. Like now, at the end of the day, we're living in 21st century. Pretty much everyone has internet, even my parents. My mom just signed up for Facebook like a month ago, but she has no idea what I do. But what I'm trying to say is I think we should come up with a system. At least I don't really know if it works in our community, but I'm sure there's all this next gen young kids thirsty to be, obviously they care about the community environment, they grow up in it, etc. And I think we just need to empower it and make them the scientists. And anyways, that's my 2 cents.
I think in terms of Arctic policy, I think, I guess for people who are decision makers, I think listening more to the voices of the folks here and recognizing, when we think about loss of land as a result of climate change, the Arctic often is not a part of that conversation. We think about island nations, and that's critically important, and I'm glad that those voices are starting to be heard. But communities in the Arctic are losing their land as a result of permafrost thaw, as a result of erosion, as a result of fires, and all of these things are connected. And so I think getting these sort of slow onset events in northern regions into the conversation about loss and damage is critically important. In the U.S., there's also right now these erosion, permafrost thaw is also, there's zero climate change adaptation planning in our country, and so there's just sort of no leadership at all and no guidance at all. So I think hearing these voices, getting a better understanding of what's happening right now on the ground, I think is really important. And then I think as a scientist, I guess I'll say I'll stop there. I'll shut up and listen now and pass this on to others, because I really am fortunate to have this opportunity to be on this stage, but also to learn from, Darcy and I have worked together for a long time, but just to taking that time to listen and to learn and being humble and being uncomfortable at times, I think is really important.
I think that what you said is really important. Ensuring that there's listening happening, ensuring that there's communication happening between Indigenous communities and research. I mean, I understand I'm talking to a majority of researchers here. And I think really what's critically important on the research side is that co-development is making sure that when it comes time to publish a paper, when it comes time to write a paper, when it comes time to research a topic, that topic is informed by Indigenous views. I understand that sometimes this won't be the case, but in the majority of the things that you write, I ask you to reach out to the community before you submit an abstract or before you submit a proposal, and you say, these are some ideas that I have. What do you think? Foster those relationships with communities, foster those relationships with individuals so that they're in a position to be able to help direct research towards the issues that are present on the ground. There's a saying that's in our community, which is that Indigenous peoples used to not trust researchers, but now we just can't tolerate them. And that's partly because sometimes research can get a little bit esoteric. I'm sure anybody who's spent more than 5 hours in front of Google Scholar knows that sometimes it can get a bit into the weeds. And so that is important to get down to the bottom level, but it's also important to have broader applicability. So making sure that when working with Indigenous communities, there's a clear applicability to that community. In terms of policies, right now you're watching as carbon markets are emerging. We're seeing the commodification of carbon. Before it was oil. Before that it was gold. Now it's carbon. And in order to ensure that there's protection for Indigenous peoples and our environment, we need to really focus on what's being talked about in Article 6. That means ensuring that there's human rights protections and environmental rights protections. That means ensuring that there is full and effective participation for Indigenous communities when it comes time to designate these sites. And it means making sure, and participation is not consultation. Again, it is a right of refusal on a policy. And then also making sure that there's redress mechanisms in the event that such policies fail. So I guess in closing, I ask all of you to go about your research and to just ask the simple question, one, of how can I help? And then two, explain how this relates to me in our Indigenous communities. Explain those relevancies and ask those questions. And I think you'll be surprised by your results. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to give it to Darcy.
Yeah. So before I give my short answer, do you want to explain what Article 6 is to people who don't know?
So Article 6 is the part of the convention here that is regarding carbon markets, figuring out. So I'm sure all of you have heard about cap and trade or carbon markets or things like this. Essentially what it's saying is that I'm going to run my car here or my oil well here, and then in order to offset the carbon that's going to be emitted as a result of this production, I'm going to set aside this land over here. And there's concern for this for Indigenous peoples and environmentalists alike, in the sense that land that's set aside to be considered a carbon reserve can be very restrictive on what happens. In the United States, we have something called the Park Service. And what they do is they set aside land and they call it a preserve. And the mandate is to preserve the land. And under a lot of doctrines of land management, we don't see people as part of an ecosystem. And that's a fickle thing. Yes, Western civilization really isn't part of an ecosystem. Indigenous communities are. We're the stewards of our environment. We're really the only ones that can call the forest our home. And we are the ones who do population management, clean up our forests, make sure that there's controlled burns in certain communities and in certain areas. And so when you pull us out of an environment, you can see the changes to the ecosystem. And so in set-asides, we want to make sure that subsistence is able to continue. We want to make sure that our rights to our way of life are not infringed. And then in terms of development, we also want to make sure that we are equals at that table. We're able to say, no, this can't happen here, or no, this can't happen this way. This has to happen according to these terms that we lay out, or this happens with a profit sharing agreement or something of that nature. So we want to make sure that these are safeguards that protect our rights and protect our lands. And really at the end of the day, I think enforce Indigenous sovereignty. The idea that we have the power of decision over our lands, over our ways of life, and over our peoples. And so that's really where those concerns come about with Article 6 and kind of how that fits into this larger picture of trying to build a new world that's based in clean and green energy.
Yeah. So Article 6 is a huge topic of conversation, or it should be here at COP. So if you don't know too much about it, I'd encourage you to delve into it. It's a big issue. I think my takeaway message wouldn't be too different than everybody else's. It's, do ethical research. Care about people before you care about research. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're not all scientists. And Indigenous people are living on the land, and we have been for many generations. We are very in touch with place. We know our resources and the land that are on the resources, or the resources that are on the land, insanely well. We're very in tune with what's happening. We have a lot of knowledge, and we're, again, the ones feeling the impacts, I'd say, the most heavily. So make sure it's ethical, make sure your research is applicable. Like Sam said, work with communities, not on them, not alongside them, work with them, include them in your research, give them financial compensation, give them the credit where it's due, and realize that there are different knowledge systems and different ways of knowing and different value systems that are just as valid as Western ones, if not more. So yeah, I guess that'd be my end takeaway message. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but we might have some time for questions. But I think that's it for us in terms of questions that I have. So thank you.
All of you, that's been another absolutely fascinating discussion. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll just check if we have any of those coming in online, and otherwise we definitely, I think, have some from the floors. Would you like to come up to the microphone and ask a question?
Sure. Can anyone hear me? I don't have the headphones on anymore. So I think there was an announcement yesterday, and I'm probably going to get the figure wrong, but something like 1.7 billion for supporting Indigenous people to get land tenure rights. And I don't know how much, kind of which Indigenous people that affected, but super interesting talk, and thank you all so much. But I wanted to know your perspective on those kind of financial big pledges and commitments versus kind of what you've talked about in terms of actually working with, policymakers coming to you and involving you in those discussions, and kind of what do you think about that financial announcement and what it will actually do for Indigenous people, and how much can that solve the problem versus what you've already talked about?
Yeah, so I'll just say really quickly, thank you. Give that money to Indigenous people, period.
I think that when it comes to large donations, money's always a good thing when it's spent right. Money's a good thing because it helps us enact our policies. There's this strange idea that without resources, you can't actually be sovereign. And that's a reality for our sovereign communities in the U.S. But in terms of large donations, they're big numbers. They're big numbers that go to big organizations that rarely end up on the ground. The best way to make investments in Indigenous communities is on the ground. It's not from the top down, it's from the bottom up. We know how to manage our lands best. We know how to manage our people best, and we know how to affect change for our community in the best way. We don't need organizations like Greenpeace or anything else coming in and telling us, one, how we need to live, or two, how we should be spending resources, or three, spending resources on our behalf without our direction. So large dollar pledges, wonderful. They do good things, but that money rarely ends up on the ground with our communities, and the better place for it is making those direct cash infusions to communities who are struggling with needs, and that's really what I think there.
I'm very pessimistic. I don't think any of this pledge is going to come to Russia. Let's start it there. And I already provided some example where even our community environmental program was kind of shut down because they can't receive any foreign money. So that's the starting point, and just grassroots work with small organizations. So I'm personally part of 2 philanthropic organizations, and we only finance small community-run, community-owned. I don't know if you would formally say organizations. It's like community-led initiatives. Yeah, but that's a lot of work, to make sure that you need to co-create. Like my main thing is all about co-creation. So otherwise, we're not gonna go far.
Thank you for the important question. Do we have any other questions from the floor today? Okay. Oh, yes, we do.
Hi. I can't. Yeah, it's very strange listening and not listening. Just wondering about any tips you might have. It might not be in your remit, for how to get that funding to include payments to Indigenous people and communities that are participating in research, and whether academic funders look at that favourably. You don't necessarily have to have answers to that. It's a good principle, but if you do have any, that would be great to hear. Thanks.
Yeah. So in my experience in Alaska, I know one person who's involving Indigenous people in their research and is providing financial compensation. So to collect data, things like that. That's one that I've heard of in the entire state, and there are 3 universities in that state in Alaska. He was my advisor for my PhD that I did very briefly. Didn't finish, withdrew because of ethical reasons, but just do it, period. In terms of advice on how to include Indigenous people and get that funding to them, work with policymakers, get lawyers involved, get other researchers involved, get all the necessary parties involved, and just talk, get in a circle and talk and figure it out. I mean, there are ways, it seems really daunting because you don't learn how to do that in a PhD or in a master's, or you don't learn how to talk to people in academia. So I think that is just a first practice that you can do in order to get the resources where they're going to be used best, and just get Indigenous people that money because they need it. Money is always a good thing, but a lot of it usually, the amount that Indigenous people get out of the total funds that are allocated is despairingly small. And it's from my perspective, it's pretty polarized and not just at all. So Sue, yeah.
Yeah, and this is just a specific technical. I mean, in the U.S., a big funder is the National Science Foundation. You definitely can and should put in funding. And so what we do is we give funding directly to the tribes, and then decisions on who it goes to within the tribe is allocated and decided by the tribe. So some agencies in the U.S. you can, and some agencies you can't, but it certainly is feasible. You just have to do it. Yeah.
We work with an organization called Future Footwear Foundation, and we've been financing research in collaboration with indigenous communities for 7 years. And if you're interested, I can put you in touch, and I can see already you're wearing Vivos. Well done.
Thank you so much. I think, and are there any last remarks from any of our panelists, or are we happy to wrap up? Okay, well, thank you again so much for your perspectives and your knowledge and your experience. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for joining us and for your questions. And our next session will be at 2:30, and that is looking at infrastructure damage and coastal erosion. So it'll be another really interesting session. Thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists.